Great. Thanks so much, Helen, and welcome, everybody. I know we've got people who are still joining us. We had over 600 people sign up for this webinar, and we know that at least in a couple of places there were groups of 25 or 30 or more people who were watching off of one sign-up. And at one level, of course, we're glad to have so many people be able to join us, but more importantly, I think that that speaks to the seriousness of this issue for us today and the kinds of concerns that people have in places all over, not only the United States, but we have people from all around the world. So welcome to all. This is Howard Ross, and I'd like to introduce, just to welcome you, and also to introduce my partner in crime here, Allison Manswell.
Hello, I'm Allison Manswell. Thank you, Howard. This is really such a pleasure for us to do this. We've been intending and planning for this for a while, and it's really nice to have so many people on the line for this.
Great. So we're going to jump in, and just for those of us who aren't familiar, those folks who aren't familiar with Cook-Ross, we've been around since 1989. We're a certified woman-owned organization based in Silver Spring, Maryland, which for those of you who don't know is literally a 10-minute walk from the District of Columbia, so we're just outside of Washington, D.C. Although we work all over the world. We've worked in 48 of the United States and over 50 other countries over the course of our 27 years in business. We work on organizational culture development, leadership, and transformation with a particular focus on diversity and inclusion. Our mission is to transform the world to be more inclusive, one organization at a time. And we've got 43 full-time staff people and 25 additional associates. We also have a number of programs that are available. We'll talk a little bit more about them a little bit later for those of you who want to look at what other kinds of things we're doing.
And it has been such a pleasure for me to join the Cook-Ross team. After years in different corporate environments, I have found it's really been a pleasure to be able to work in the area that I'm passionate about in terms of diversity and inclusion, and especially race is a particular focus area of mine, not only because of my lived experience, but because of the impact that it has on our communities in general. So when we think about what's really going on and why would we even be focusing on race, a couple of different reasons. Contrary to some of the narrative we might have heard during maybe even the Obama administration, race is still a very prominent issue in our society. It has not gone anywhere. We've made a lot of progress, but it continues to be a challenge. And the greatest degree of polarity exists between people of color that we colloquially call black and white people. And so much of our focus today, you'll hear us use those terms, but please know that when we say black or even African American specifically, we are including all people of color. And then in addition to that, there's a world of intersectionality between the issue of race and the other elements of diversity that we have focused on. Howard, you've done a number of other webinars, including ones on race. Leslie and Rosalind did one on race. You did one with Allison Robinson on transgender issues, as well as one on Islamophobia. And so the intersectionality of diversity is prevalent as well, and today we'll focus on how race impacts us.
One of the things we also are really conscious about is how these dynamics of race have been accentuated by recent political events, some of the reaction to the political campaign, and the rise of voices in a much louder way than we've seen for a while. So we want to be very aware of the fact that our current times are bringing things up to the surface in a way that we haven't seen in a while.
Absolutely. So let's get started with a poll, and just thinking about just race, let's just see where everybody is around how much of a factor race is in today's workplace. So if you would, please use your poll questions to make your vote now. So do you believe that race is a factor in today's workplace? A, is a significant factor. B, often a factor. C, sometimes a factor. D, rarely, and E, not at all.
All right, the poll's open on the right-hand side of your screen. Just go and select your response and click on Submit. All right, poll is closing at this time.
Great.
And as WebEx tabulates, I will ensure the results in a moment.
All right, perfect. So as we wait for the result, the official results, I'm sure that, you know, by virtue of just being the ones who selected to be on this webinar, I don't think we're going to be totally shocked by the results, but I do think it's really important to see. So yeah, we are at 39% believe that race is still a significant factor, 36% believe that it's often a factor, 19% believe it's sometimes a factor, 2% rarely a factor, and 1% of us believe it's not a factor at all. So we're probably not totally shocked to see that the majority of people, not a large majority, but the majority of people believe it is a significant factor. I think it's important to note that there are some people that really feel it's only sometimes a factor, and some, you know, small percentage of people don't feel it's a factor at all. And again, it's not to say that race is always a factor in every single interaction. That is not our intention at all, but we do just want to get a sense of to what extent is race showing up in our workplace as an issue.
Yeah, and I think, Allison, one of the things that's really challenging is that we sometimes look for the times when it's really obvious when race is a factor, but the more challenging times are when it's a subtext for conversations that may occur as a racial dynamic for some people, but may be completely oblivious to other people that race is in fact influencing their decisions, and of course may have nothing to do with their intention, with their conscious intention, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So what we're going to do in today's webinar is, first of all, we're going to outline some of the challenges that this brings up, offer the benefits of working together across race in an effective way, look at the impact that all of this has, and then finally provide some ideas for a path forward, ways that we can move forward to have more constructive conversations. We'll talk with asking a question, and we're going to invite people to go ahead and respond to this question in your box, and we'll read as many as we can. And we did get a note from somebody that said, please include brown when you say black, although the intention is to be inclusive. It may not come across that way. Thank you for that. And of course, one of the challenges we have, we will definitely do that. One of the challenges we have is in trying to cover the topic deeply without getting too broad. So we don't mean in any way to be exclusive of people who are Hispanic, Latino, or Asian, or any other groups of color. So we will definitely try to include that in our language. Thank you for that. So what stops people from talking about race in the workplace? So let's hear from a couple of people. If you could go ahead down in the lower area on the right-hand side where you could pose questions. Please go ahead and put some responses up. What are some things that's come up? So we have one person who says discomfort of the subject, fear. White people in positions of power who aren't interested in talking about race or realizing it. Awkwardness, being judged. Race is political and they're afraid of saying something. Afraid of appearing bigoted. Afraid of upsetting colleagues. Afraid to say the wrong thing. Lack of communications.
Not sure if it will be uncomfortable. These are all really good reasons. They represent the full spectrum of what happens and why we tend not to talk about race.
People change the subject, feeling discomfort. I want to read a few more of these because they're just so on target. People are afraid of retaliation if you make a mistake, if you say the wrong thing. This is one of the challenges that we've had with in our dialogue culturally, is that because people sometimes feel like if they accidentally say the wrong thing, they get punished for it or chastised for it, they decide not to talk about the subject at all because it's safer than trying to talk about it and saying the wrong thing. So, some people say because it doesn't affect me personally, it's too personal and uncertain how the conversation will go.
Yeah, and the fact of it being so associated with current social issues, this new political climate has just changed things for people, and they don't know where to land. Unsure how to communicate to people in different job categories. Certainly the differences between people's roles, between the expectations. And this is interesting. I feel that my company is dedicated to diversity, and as a result, white people are discriminated against. And certainly that feeling of reverse discrimination exists, and we want to acknowledge the fact that they're on the other side when we talk too much about it, and I'm saying too much in air quotes, people on the other end might feel like it doesn't include me.
One of the challenges, of course, we have is that we have our perceptions of what's going on, and then we have the reality of what's going on. And often when we change to a different way of being, it seems like favoritism is happening when a correction in place is put in place, because the pattern that we have, of course, has existed for so long. Somebody also wrote white fragility, and that's a term that's been recently coined to reflect on how uncomfortable it is for white people to feel accused of or held accountable for our transgressions around race.
And we're noticing here on the flip side, when we involve the white population in the discussion, they make it all about them and take the voice away from people of color. I can understand people feeling that way, that it then becomes, we minimize the impact to some extent. So these are all such important issues. Everyone from my office is from a different culture. Race is not an issue at all. We do talk about interesting differences from our home cultures. You know, that's actually a really great point, because one of the things when we ask the question about race in the workplace, each workplace is actually different. So we are not assuming that all workplaces are homogeneous at all, or that all workplaces have the same challenges. There are some workplaces, like this one being expressed here, where people do have a very open relationship to talk about. I would say Cook Ross is kind of like that. We actually talk and greet each other, and we talk openly about our differences. So that's a really positive note to make. And maybe let's talk a little bit more about what's happening behind the scenes of all these different elements that are coming into the workplace. Howard, what's happening behind the scenes?
Well, we know that, as I said before, that we know that we've seen in the last couple of years reemergence, not that it ever disappeared, but an emergence in a much louder and a prominent way of this conversation. It, of course, was triggered by a large number of shootings of African-American men and women by police officers. We don't need to go through the list of people for us all to remember the incidents that I'm referring to, certainly Michael Brown in Ferguson and Eric Garner in New York, and all of the similar kinds of incidents that occurred. We know that the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in response to that has also been controversial, and there's something really interesting to see in the controversy behind this. We know that there are strong voices in support of Black Lives Matter, and there's some people who feel very, very threatened. It's not lost on us that when we were just reading the responses that you had to the previous question, that so many people's responses, including I'm afraid of, fear, I'm concerned about, because fear is the binding characteristic of our difficulty in talking about this issue. But there's another aspect as well, which is that we have different perceptions of the same thing. Now, Black Lives Matter is a good example. We argue about these three words. People have very different views of these three words. But in actuality, we're not arguing about three words at all. We're actually arguing about four words. The problem is that the fourth word is invisible, and it's different for the two groups. For one group, it's only Black Lives Matter, and that's how they read that message and therefore respond in that way. Wait a second, Black lives aren't the only ones that matter. For the other group, it's Black Lives Matter too. And that's the message that's trying to be communicated from that group. And so this is one of the things that we really want to emphasize. As long as dynamics like this, these different perceptions, occur under the surface and unconsciously, it's very difficult for us to realize what we're actually talking about. We know that beyond that, that race is showing up in the anti-immigrant feelings that we're hearing, the fact that certain countries are identified as more threatening than others because of either the race or religion of the people in those countries. Certainly the anti-Mexican immigration feeling that's there is tapped into by race as well. We also know that there's been a dramatic rise in white supremacy, dramatic numbers, actually staggering increase in the numbers of hate groups that are forming. Some of this is because of the power of social media. The people who maybe in the past would be in their basement by themselves with a computer spewing things out now can find 5,000 people like them all around the country and form a group. And we know that we've seen some of this quite overtly. And when we look at statistics from the Southern Poverty Law Center, we know that these groups are now more robust than any time that we know in recorded history. And so it's no surprise, of course, that hate crimes have also jumped up. And you can see kind of the general areas where we see the most of these. One of the things that's very interesting about these statistics is that you'll notice, obviously, that there are very few hate crimes in places where there's very little diversity. And this is an interesting dynamic in the research that we've done and seen about race and particularly strong patterns of racism or bias against people of color, and that is that the places in the country where there are the fewer people of color generally register the highest levels of racial bias when people are tested. Now, it's kind of doesn't make much sense when you think about it, except I think what it speaks to is the fact when we don't have real people to interact with, we fall back on our stereotypes of people. And all of this, of course, is a function, as I said before, of fear. What happens when we get fearful is that fearful times tend to intensify us versus them thinking. And so we tend to use stereotypes to help us to determine who they are in order to be safe. So we want to take a minute. I know some of you who are longtime friends and colleagues and clients, know that we have a particular way of looking at bias that's really foundational to our work. And I just want to quickly review that for those who may not be familiar with it, because it's really critical to understand our approach to this. And we know bias is out there. We all have a sense of that, or most of us, I'm sure, have a sense that bias is a part of our everyday life. But we still, most of us, see bias as something that's negative. This sort of bias equals badness paradigm is part of our culture. And there's no question, of course, that it can have a negative implication at times. We know that that's the case. But we also know that there are times when bias can serve us. For example, if you're able to spot something that's threatening before it gets to you and avoid it, you're using bias in an effective way. All bias actually is a tendency or inclination that results in judgment without question. It's an automatic brain response. We can't stop ourselves from having them. And it's also a shortcut to interact with our world. Now, one of the reasons it's important for us to recognize the normalcy of bias is because when we think that having bias makes us a bad person, the challenge with that is that we will tend to deflect or try to find reasons to explain our bias rather than actually taking responsibility for it and looking at how it's affecting our behavior. Very few people that I know wake up in the morning and go to work and say, how can I suppress the people of color in my organization today? And yet the behaviors still occur that we know differentially impact one person versus the other. So we want to try to create a sense of normalcy so that people can openly look at, discuss, and learn to mitigate and navigate their biases. And in order to do that, what we found is one thing that's really helpful is to have a better understanding of how the brain actually processes information. We know that we see things out in front of us and we have a particular reaction. I'm sure everybody on this call can think of a time when you saw somebody and you had an immediate visceral reaction to them. If you're with other people in the room right now, you could probably glance around the room and remember the first time you saw certain people and whether you were drawn to them or you felt a little bit of concern. You immediately thought they looked like a good person or you immediately wondered about them. That's a very natural way for us to respond to human beings. In fact, it's so normal that we can only believe that through evolution it's been built into our survival modality. If I was living in a cave and I saw a group of people around the water hole, I had to instantly determine whether it was them or us, and if I made the wrong determination, I would die. So this has a tendency to focus people's behavior. We'll have a tendency to spot these things up front. And we can see now through current neurocognitive research how that happens in the brain. We see something out there, which we're referring to here as a catalyzing person or circumstance, some person, some circumstance that we're in, and immediately the fast brain, which is characterized by the green area here, the limbic system of the brain, picks up that signal. It's important for us to understand also that the limbic system is oriented more towards danger than it is towards reward. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you're evolving a brain over thousands of years, I should say, which would you better be prepared for? If you miss reward and it's coming your way, it's a nice surprise. If you miss danger and it's coming your way, you're dead. So we have an orientation more towards danger. In fact, if we look at the brain science behind it, it takes about 20% more brain power, glucose flow, blood flow, all of that, to see something positive than it does to see something negative. We're more oriented to clearing out the negative before you see the positive. What happens is the brain gets that image through the amygdala, runs quickly to the hippocampus, the memory center of the brain, kind of like running to the file cabinet and say, what is that? And then says, okay, this is either safe or not, and then to the hypothalamus, the air traffic controller of the brain, which sends a message out to us as to what to do about it. Now, in certain circumstances, this fast brain thinking can save our lives. We might say that this all occurs more emotionally. Oops, I jumped ahead of myself, excuse me. It can save our lives. For example, if you're driving to work in the morning and you see a tail light come on in a car in front of you and somebody hits their brakes, you don't want to go to your slow brain and say, oh, what's the best thing to do now, or you'd end up in their back seat. Your foot responds and hits that brake pedal before you have a chance to even think about it, and in that case might save your life. The same thing could be true if somebody is coming at you in a hostile way. Of course, there are other times when the slow brain is more valuable, and this is where the other part of the brain comes in the prefrontal cortex, the red area you can see here. This is the part of our brain that actually gives us the ability to watch ourselves think. Say, wow, I have a reaction here, but is it appropriate to the circumstances? Perhaps I have a visceral reaction because somebody reminds me of somebody. They're dangerous. We think they're dangerous, but in fact they're completely innocent. But the fact that I've made that reaction, unless I bring my slow brain in place and say, let me take a breath for a minute, let me make sure, can be obviously tragic. We've actually been doing some work with law enforcement people and teaching them to use things like breathing techniques on their way to emergent crime scenes so that they can put in that extra split second that might in fact save somebody's life. So the slow brain is an incredibly important part of our functioning for us to get clearer and more conscious about how this impacts us. We generally associate the fast brain with our emotional response and the slow brain with our thinking response. So the problem is that we largely think of system 2 thinking, our slow brain, as the primary way that we relate to the world. Most of us believe that we're rational. But overwhelmingly what we know is that the opposite is true. In fact, that the fast brain really guides the ship far more than we realize. Just to give you a sense of physicality about that, if you imagine the slow brain to be roughly the size of a gallon milk jug, the fast brain is like the Milky Way, literally hundreds of thousands of times more fast brain activity than slow brain activity. And so what that means is that we're reacting far more than we're thinking. And what we then often do is justify our reaction. So if I have an emotional reaction to somebody, let's say I'm in a situation, an African-American man approaches me, I'm alone, it's a place where I'm feeling vulnerable. Even though he does nothing to threaten me, my visceral reaction, based on the stereotypes I've seen, may bring fear up in me, and that then causes me to begin to look at him in a way that may, in fact, have me look at things that I would not normally notice. Well, why does he have his hand like that, or what's he, all of these things. Now, clearly, the challenge is, in some cases, if somebody is dangerous, this could be helpful. In other cases, it could lead to very negative behavior. All of this is, of course, difficult to sort out, we understand, and we're certainly not saying that this is simple, but that in fact we just need to practice being a little bit more conscious about it. Now, one other aspect about this, and that is that we want to look at what happens when we're in a prolonged fear situation like we are now. We might say that we're in almost collective societal post-traumatic stress right now, and that we've all been bathed with this constant story for the last several years. Again, I mean, many of us for our whole lives have we've been paying attention, but certainly, again, more public in the last few years, which creates a sense of prolonged concern about this prolonged tension. And what we know, Daniel Goleman, who we, of course, associate with emotional intelligence, calls this an amygdala hijacking. What we know happens at times like this is when the amygdala takes over the system, takes over the brain is bathed with a cocktail of adrenaline, epinephrine, and cortisol, which are stress drugs. It keeps us at sort of a low level of stress the whole time. But we're beginning to understand now through some really fascinating research that's been done by a scientist named Ben Palmer in Australia, that this has three fundamental impacts on us. One are, of course, the typical reactive responses, fight, flight, and freeze, and people have actually, I'm sure people listening have felt these in the body. Some of you have even felt them when somebody comes up to you at the workplace and says, I think we have a concern about race, and all of a sudden you feel in your body, uh-oh, this tension that comes up, or somebody asks you a question, or you hear people talking, or even see people talking at times, and the question, are they talking about me? Did I, all of these kinds of things are fight, flight, and freeze responses. We also have protective responses, and that is at times when we feel a lot of fear, we tend to either desire control ourselves, look at ways we can fix, manage, and control the circumstance, or we turn towards people who are authoritative. people who we feel like can, quote, save us. These are often male power figures who we turn to. Historically, we can see times like this, for example, in Germany or in Italy in the 1930s, certainly are great examples of this. Afghanistan before the Taliban, where cultures had so much fear, so much concern, that they actually turned towards authoritarian leaders to take over in those times. And then the last, which is really fascinating, is that we also narrow our thinking and interpretation at these times. We begin to think that what's going on is permanent, pervasive, and it's personal. It's going to be about me. And so, for example, recent polling shows that people living in rural areas in the United States, about 2/3 of them believe that they are personally, imminently in danger of a terrorist attack. Now, we're certainly not saying that something like that couldn't happen, but it's unlikely given the history we've seen. Nonetheless, these are the fears that people have. And I was just recently reading a story about Montana, for example, where there's a strong movement to make Sharia law illegal, even though I think they said in the last 5 years there have been 7 Muslim immigrants to Montana. Nonetheless, as I said before, the stereotypes are more powerful in that case than the reality.
And Howard, just one additional point. There's many people are kind of struggling with what's happening in America right now, and I think that this part right here gives us at least a way to intellectually understand some of what's happened in our own political environment right here in America. And although the intellectual explanation might not make us feel any better, it's helpful just to understand some of the science and maybe even the phenomenon behind what we've seen and probably could never have imagined on our own.
Yeah, and I think it's a great point, Allison, and I think in addition to that, it's important for us to realize it's not just in America. You know, we saw what happened in Brexit, which was clearly influenced by racial dynamics. Holland, the election just yesterday, an extreme right-wing candidate almost won. Previous election in Austria, the election in France coming up, the polling around there. So we know that this is happening throughout the Western world, and it's deeply influencing politics because of this very reason. And the last point of this is to recognize that what happens is when you have a group in which there are real threats. So we'll use as an example Islam here. We know that there is a real threat about some people who are Muslim, who are terrorists, and we can't deny that that's a real threat. But what happens in the mind, particularly when the mind is under amygdala hijacking, is it's almost like we decide it's safer to have a perceived threat about everybody than it is to worry about which ones are the dangerous ones. In other words, if I'm afraid of people who are different from me, there's part of my mind that says, if you keep all of them away from me, I'm not going to have to figure out which ones are safe. And this is why we see during times like this a rise of what we might call the isms or phobias, whether it's Islamophobia or transphobia or racism or heterosexism or homophobia. Any of these things often come up at times when I'm concerned about the individual, but I don't know which is the individual I should be concerned about. So as a result of that, I go ahead and just try to stay away from all people like that. And then finally, this leads to a whole range of reactions. We might start on the far right side here, overt discriminatory behavior, the kind of thing that we see when people have signs that say keep them out, or overt racist behavior from one person to another or from groups towards another. To a lesser degree, it might include covert hostility. It's hostility that's there. It may not be spoken, but it gets acted out in the energy that people feel. Underneath that, it might be, I'm just going to stay away from this issue. There might be judgment underneath there, but I don't even really see at this level that I have any bias. I just think people are the way I think they are, so I judge them based on my own perceptions without realizing it's my own perceptions. Then we get to sort of a midpoint, if you will, tolerance, and we have that in quotes just because, I don't know about the rest of you, but I've never aspire to be tolerated in my life. Yeah. And yet sometimes we think this is a high state of being, which I guess says something about how hopeless we can be and resigned we can be about our racial dynamics. And then moving to the other side is understanding that we have attitudes, but that we may misunderstand what those attitudes are, where they're coming from, and finally, at its deeper level, biases that we are not even aware that are there. And in fact, which can contradict dramatically with our conscious view of ourselves. And this is really important to get, especially for those of us who see ourselves as advocates for diversity, people who are see ourselves as more progressive on that issue, to not realize that even though we may have a conscious attitude that we think that we're fair, we think that we really believe in treating people fairly, and I mean that in the sense that if you could put me on a lie detector test, I would actually pass that test. I may still, underneath the surface, have some unconscious biases that are impacting my interaction. So how might that show up? Let's say I'm interviewing Allison for a management position, and as an African-American woman, I'm looking at her, and my conscious belief is, boy, it would be really great if we could get more diversity in our leadership. I would be thrilled if we could get a strong African-American woman for this position. But underneath the surface, in my unconscious, I'm comparing Allison to my image of leaders, which look a lot more like me, white men. And so it might show up as, I really like her, but I wish she had more executive presence, or I wish she was more articulate, or I wish she, some other manifestation of culture or of race or of gender or whatever, that in my mind, it's a feeling more than it is a thought, and it's conflicting, almost like a tug of war with those conscious feelings I have. And this is one of the reasons why it's so important, why we believe it's so important to get away from this self-damnation and guilt all the time, to be able to really look and take responsibility for these belief systems. Because when we think having those thoughts make us a bad person, obviously our ego structures are going to cover them up.
Mm-hmm. And so now that we've had a chance to kind of dig deep into what gets us here, what we want to shift to now and talk about is what's the impact? The impact of the element of race, specifically in terms of talent management, is that it shows up in our hiring. It shows up in how we assess people's performance in the workplace, how we onboard employees, certainly who and how promotions are distributed or decided on, salary, and that could be anything from initial offer and or increases and any other compensation decision along the way. Who gets a special assignment, who gets tagged to go on a special project, who gets to engage in professional development. And what's important about the impact, is, especially when it comes to race in the workplace, is that for most families, the only economy that really matters for them is the every 2-week salary that they earn from their income. And so if we can make a difference here, where people are actually earning that income, ultimately, I personally believe we can make a difference in our communities. And that, therein, for me, lies the reason for why race in the workplace is such an important element to focus on. And so, how exactly do these decisions get perpetuated? Let's talk a little bit about what are some of the ways in which these racial biases get perpetuated. Certainly, it's from some of the different messages that we get. And let's talk about where those messages come from and the lens through which we see them.
Before we go there, Allison, somebody sent an interesting question in response to what I talked about to be the interviewing example. I think it's worth talking about. The question is, why would I want to choose Allison to be hired to increase racial diversity? I should only be worried if she's the best match for a position. I guess that what we're saying is there are some times when racial diversity is part of what makes somebody the best match for a decision. We have a lot of research that shows this. Some of you may be aware of Scott Page, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, wrote a brilliant book called The Difference. And what Scott studied was using mathematical algorithms. He's actually a PhD mathematician from Caltech originally. Using mathematical algorithms, he studied the whole question of, does diversity actually increase performance in organizations? And he found that there's a direct mathematical proof that having people of broader levels of identities actually increases problem solving, it increases innovation, and it increases our ability to deal with circumstances around us in organizations. So in certain cases, yes, race might be a positive factor. Now, that doesn't mean hiring somebody who's unable to do the job simply because they're of a particular race. It just may be a factor. And somebody said...
So let me just make another point about that, because the underlying question here, and actually Leslie and I were having an interesting conversation about this. When we say, shouldn't we just pick the person who is the best match, note that our version of best is embedded in our own version of awesomeness. And I call this the awesomeness factor, right? Because we all wake up every morning with this notion that we are all individually pretty darn awesome. But what happens is our ability to see the awesomeness of someone else is impacted when they don't look like us. So, for example, when I'm interviewing an African-American woman who might be 5 years into her career and we are looking for what's her potential, it's very easy for me to see her potential, and I've actually had this happen in a role. It's very easy for me to see her potential because I can ascribe my own awesomeness, and it allows me to see her potential. What I find embedded in this question is that when the person is different, it becomes it becomes more difficult to ascribe awesomeness and to see that person's potential. So when we say the best candidate, just know that best is a value judgment based on the lenses through which we're looking.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other piece to this, of course, is that we know that there's tons of research that shows how this plays out. For example, that white men are given far more stretch opportunities, jobs that they haven't proved themselves for, than either white women or men and women of color. And this is exactly a reflection of what you're talking about, Allison. I see the potential. More accurately, I feel the potential in this person, maybe because they remind me a little bit more of myself. This other person, I just need to be checked a little bit more. I need to qualify it. So, by the way, somebody asked again for that citation. His name is Scott E. Page, P-A-G-E, and he's a professor at the University of Michigan. The book is called The Difference. It was published by Princeton University, I believe, in 2007 or 2008.
Yeah. The other thing, somebody else asked a question about if there are two candidates that are identical, then race difference is an additional benefit that can break the tie. And I just also feel the need to say that we are not at all advocating to pick someone simply because of any diversity element, race or otherwise. And as a person of color, I'm going to just personally say, stop it. Don't do that, because it doesn't benefit anybody. Because what happens, there are some other dynamics that we'll talk about in a moment, whereby if that person is not successful, people of color and people of different diversities tend to be judged and with the peanut butter effect to spread over their entire group. So therefore, if Howard does hire me, and if I don't do a good job, then the next African-American female is kind of up the creek because my performance is spread across my entire group. And what we found is that the same is not true for white males. Their success or failure tends to be very individualized and not spread across their entire group. So just that important note. I wouldn't want anybody going away with the wrong impression.
That's, that's such an important point for us to emphasize, Allison, that this is an added tax that women, people of color carry in the workplace. And we can see it publicly. Look, when Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols blew up Oklahoma City, or, the people who shot up Columbine, all these, we didn't hear about white male terrorism. We heard about these individuals being terrorists. As soon as Muslim people do it, all of a sudden they're Muslim terrorists. And this is a natural thing to happen. It's not good, but it's natural, and that is we tend to look at people in non-dominant groups more from their group identity, and more people in dominant groups as individuals. And so it's really important to see that. The other thing is that I wanted to say is that the reason it makes sense to use this as a qualifying factor, to use race as a qualifying factor or as an extra benefit, is because in an increasingly diverse society, if we have employees who are increasingly diverse racially, and we have a management team that's only white, we may not be able to tap into what's needed in that employee group as much to get the high kinds of engagement that we want. If we've got a customer base that's increasingly diverse, and we don't have any people in leadership who represent that customer base, we may not be able to tap into that. So that's one of the really important factors in this as well. The last point is, relative to the whole conversation about qualifications, is that qualifications, we sometimes think that we can compare sort of apples to apples. So we say, let's say we're doing entry into a college. We say, well, we're going to look at their grade point average, we're going to look at their extracurricular activities, and we're going to look at their SAT scores, and that's going to be, we're going to, remove bias from the circumstance. We're going to make that. But let's imagine two different people coming in. One is a young man who grew up in Potomac, Maryland. I'll use that just because that's our local area, which is the high-rent district, to say the least. Mom was a doctor. Dad was a lawyer. He had built-in tutors at home and certainly enough money in the home to get him any support he needed. He didn't have to work after school because his family had wealth, and so instead he could participate in all kinds of extracurricular activities. He was a captain of the debate society and played on the soccer team. He was in student government, et cetera. He took a couple of SAT prep courses, plus had a personal coach around SAT, and he took the SATs a couple of times to raise his scores, and so he ends up with a 4.2 with a high SAT score and all these great extracurriculars. Person number two grew up in another place, let's say Anacostia. I'll use that as an example. It's a low-income part of D.C. Mom or dad was a single parent and worked 2 jobs to support he and his 2 younger siblings. They left the home at 7 in the morning, didn't come back until 9 at night off of their 2 jobs. So he would wake up every morning, get his 2 sibs ready for school, take them to school, go to school himself, pick them up after school, take them to daycare, and then go to the part-time job that he did to help support the family, picks up his sibs afterwards, gives them dinner, helps them with their homework. Only then can he get to his homework. Mom finally comes home, or dad, at 9 o'clock, and he can then concentrate on his work and does this every day, and on the weekends, of course, works both days. Now, he ends up with a 3.6 and slightly lower SATs, but no extracurriculars because he was working in his spare time. Now, we could look at the 2 of those if we were comparing apples to apples, and we'd say, well, one is clearly more qualified. But if we look at the background story, we can see that what it took for this other young person to get a 3.6 and the SATs he got, in addition to handling all the family responsibility, may be more impressive than what it took for somebody who was more on a gilded path. Now, we're not saying that anybody who gets a 4.2 and high SATs is bad. It just simply points to the fact that we want to be looking at who's got the potential to do this job, not necessarily comparing apples to apples.
Perfect. So let's begin to look at what some of these lenses are and the lens that's often given to us. Helen, if you'll start to get the video ready, what we're going to show is a news report that was shown on a local 6 o'clock news station, and it's probably a scenario that's all too popular.
Actually,
in Chicago.
Okay, Helen?
All right, sounds good. I am loading up the video as we speak. It should be popping up on your screen shortly. Please know that the video sound is going to be coming out of your computer speakers, so make sure you've got that turned on and up. Howard and Allison, I'm going to ask you to mute your phone line, so we're not able to...
Helen, Helen, this is actually the second video. If you could play the other one first. Okay.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah, the one with the blue front, the next one.
Yeah, that's it. No?
This one, Helen, the one that's got the blue.
Okay, give me a second. Let's see if this
is... No problem.
Is this the one?
Probably, yeah. Why don't we play that and see?
Okay, sounds good. So again, turn off your computer speakers, and the sound will be coming out of there. Thanks, everyone.
So just a few reactions. Just put in a few notes. What is your reactions when you see that? Certainly it's been too much maybe on our news, but it does evoke a certain emotion. Just let's get a few thoughts in the chat box of just how that report makes you feel. One person saying, I bet there's more to these comments. Wow, was this edited? opinionated response from newscasters create bias. Perfect. That, very, very good. Because what I want to show you now, for those of you who may have noticed, I'm going to show, Helen, if we can play that video that's coming up. And what I want to do is to show all of the footage that was actually recorded in this prolific interview with this little boy. Let's go ahead and show all the footage that was available for this interview.
Yes, this second piece, just to frame it, was actually taken by a bystander with their cell phone, so we can see the whole interview and not just the section that was shown on the news.
All right, again, turn up those speakers, and here we go.
Aha, so now there you go. There is the rest of the story that somebody else mentioned there. So you can see that you get a totally different impression when you see all of the footage that was available. I'm noticing here someone said, growing up in Brooklyn, I was mugged in high school several times. My radar is very high, and when I go home, I'm constantly scanning. Howard, what were you thinking about that?
Well, I just think that that's a great insight into seeing how our brains work. Those of us who've had a circumstance, I had a similar circumstance. I was mugged just a few years ago now, about 10 years ago, out here as an adult. And there is a tendency for, of course, our brain to use circumstances like that to prepare us to know how to deal with the world. I mean, if somebody comes up and hits you and they're wearing a red leather jacket, and it's the only time you see it, especially if it's a rare time that you see red leather jackets, the next time you see a red leather jacket or you're around them, you may have a conscious or an unconscious reaction to that. It may not be conscious, like, hey, they're wearing a red leather jacket just like that guy who beat me up. It may be a visceral response, something about this person I don't like, and I may not even connect it to the red leather jacket. And so this comment, I think, is very appropriate for us understanding how this shows up. And of course, in the workplace, this could mean if I've had people who look like this person who are not competent, then I assume a lack of competence. If I heard stereotypes about this person that they're not competent, then I might do that as well.
And the point that I want to make here is that this is one of the ways in which we receive messages and we are taught what we should be thinking. And so when you see enough of these news reports, you may very well get the impression that, African-American men are in fact dangerous because they're being primed to be dangerous from the time they're 5 or 6 or 7 years old, when in fact that's not the case at all. So let's just do another poll and let's get a few responses about, besides the news and the media and some of those things, where else do we get messages about race? Where else are we?
It's actually not a poll. We actually want to ask people to just write in some.
Yes, yes. We're going to ask them just to write it in your chat box. Where else are some of those places that we might get messages about race? Where are we being taught what to think? Yes, indeed. Family. The narrative we heard at home is probably our first place that we get. Certainly in our schools, the fact that our textbooks and our history books are teaching our kids a certain perspective. Absolutely, in our church, our faith-based organizations are teaching a particular thought around what we believe. And when you think about the impact teachers have, these are all very, very powerful sources of the messaging. Almost everything we see on TV, and when I see that response there, TV, I think of everything from sitcoms to reality shows to documentaries to everything that gets projected to us is giving us an idea of how we should think. And unless you are very, very selective about what you watch, you could, in fact, get some very targeted messages about certain groups, in which case those targeted messages then translate into direct impact in the workplace. Social media. The notion of social media has another interesting flip side, and that is we select what social media we have access to. So I am very well aware that I look to Black Twitter when something interesting is going on, I really want to know what other Black people are thinking. That's not my only source of information, but it serves a purpose for me to get that perspective. Certainly in advertising, we know that the advertising industry is trying to do a lot better around how messages are given, and yes, indeed, the White House
or other political leaders
do give us that impression as well.
There's a comment that somebody sent in, which I think is really profound in understanding the subtlety of this sometimes, and that's somebody wrote the comment, it's also unfortunate in the media that young white men who do something dangerous are teens and young Black men are gang members. This shows up in lots of ways. The language that we use shows an interpretation. It's also been noted by people, for example, from the Annenberg School who study journalism, that when white people commit terrorist crimes, they're often talked about as being unbalanced. Their psychological profile is questioned. When people of color commit terrorist crimes, it's usually seen as simply evil. So that's a really important one as well.
Yep. Movies, good answers, events, and lack of experience, actual experiences and lack of experiences. That's a great distinction. The notion of having a lack of interaction with people of color leaves a lot of interpretation to fill in the blanks and or to allow one or two experiences to become the impression. So these are all great answers.
There's one more that I just want to note, because one of our colleagues on the line noted that after Hurricane Katrina, there was a very famous series of pair of pictures that was taken of two people. One was a Black man, and the other picture was of two white people, a man and a woman, both pictures taken after they had taken groceries from a flooded grocery store. The caption in the article about the picture with the African-American man described him as a looter. The caption in the picture of the white folks said that they found the food. Now, why is one finding and one looting? Obviously, that has to do with stereotypes, and it's another example of how this plays itself out.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure I like that one about children's books, because what this suggests is that as young as our very early readers, we're sending messages that get compounded over time. So now let's talk about what's the effect of the compounding factor of these messages, and what does the research tell us? Certainly as an organization here at Cook Ross, we use a number of sources of research, and we tend to only share the most validated ones. We're going to share a couple of them, and I'm going to start with the impact of a name on a resume. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name study. It's been repeated around the world, and the nature of the study is to take one resume that has a series of qualifications and experience, and to manipulate it by giving, in America, the way the study was done was they took one white-sounding name, let's say James Smith, and another African-American sounding name, let's say Jamal Washington, and they circulated it to 1,500 organizations that said they were looking for diversity. And what they measured was the callback ratio for each one of the resumes. As it turns out, Jamal needed to submit 2.5 times as many resumes as James did to get a callback. So remember, same resume, same qualifications, not receiving the same degree of response rate, if you will.
And by the way, it's worth noting that study has been repeated in at least 4 other countries and found to be the same relative to the dominant groups in those countries.
Absolutely. This next study, I affectionately refer to this as Poor Thomas. What they did was to look at the impact of race on performance management. 60 law firm partners were sent a legal brief and were told that Thomas Myers wrote it. Now, the legal brief was coded with spelling, grammatical, technical, and analytical errors. And what they did was they asked these law partners to read and review the brief, and the findings were quite interesting. When they were told that Thomas Myers was a Caucasian man, they gave the brief an overall quality rating of 4 out of 5. They found 10 of the errors, and they had some suggestive notes like he has potential, good analytical skills, a good writer, but needs to work on a few things. And when they were told that Thomas Myers was African American, they gave the quality rating of 3 out of 5. They found 15 errors, and the narrative was that he needs a lot of work, average is best, can't believe he went to NYU. And so what this indicates is that there's something in our listening and our evaluation of performance where the element of race is clearly documented to be showing up. Now remember, this is also one of the intersection points where performance assessments are closely tied to compensation increases. So again, we go back to the nature of this impact and how pervasive it is.
It's also important for us to put this in the context, I think, where we can all see this happening, and we even do it with our children. If you know one of your children isn't as good a student, or you perceive that one of your children isn't as good a student as another one, you look at their homework more carefully. If you perceive that one of your employees isn't as good an employee or is a dependable employee, you look at their work more carefully. But the problem is when we make that perception because of stereotypes, we may in fact be setting ourselves up to a self-fulfilling prophecy where because we're concerned more about them, we actually see more of their mistakes, which then reaffirms the belief system that we have. And this is the challenge that many people face in the workplace. It also shows up in terms of public policy. If, for example, we put in a stop and search policy, like they did in New York City for a while, in which we end up stopping overwhelmingly more men of color than any other group. In the case of New York City, 90% of the people who were stopped were either black or Latino, even though only about 48% of people who commit crimes are in those groups. Lo and behold, you will find more criminals because you're stopping more people from those groups, and that data then is used to justify continuing to do it. So it's really important for us to see how the structures and systems that we're a part of can, without us even realizing it, reinforce some of these biases. This also shows up, by the way, in the legal system. Justin Levinson, who's a professor at University of Hawaii, did a study where he showed people two pictures of prospective criminals, one named William and one named Tyrone. They were actually exactly the identical picture, one darkened and one lightened. So Tyrone looked black, William looked white, and then gave the exact same facts of an incident. And what they found were the participants were more frequently remembered aggressive details when it was Tyrone rather than it was William. In other words, the same data given to them stuck more when it aligned with people's stereotypes about who might more likely would be the criminal. He went on to say that the race of a civil plaintiff or a civil defendant or criminal defendant can act implicitly to cause people to misremember a case's facts in racially biased ways. We simply, this is what we all know is the self-fulfilling prophecy. You know, we gather evidence to support that which we already believe, and we tend to justify or ignore evidence which is counter to it. We look at it and we say, oh yeah, but there's an exception to every rule, which allows us to then keep the rule. And so we look to reinforce those things we actually believe. This, of course, is called confirmation bias, and it's something that we do not just where diversity is concerned, but in almost every aspect of our lives. We're generally tending to look to gather information so that we can be right about the things that we believe. In another case, that's another study rather, and by the way, there are over 1,500 of these studies in the last 10 years alone that show us how bias plays itself out. We've just chosen a handful, as Allison said. But we really believe in our work that it's incredibly important for us to be evidence-based, because all too often we have to admit as people in the field of diversity that sometimes folks in the field of diversity say things because we hope that they're true rather than because we can prove that they're true. And it's very important for us to look at solid research, solid evidence, and we have the evidence, so it's a matter of doing our homework and finding it. The second study around this, which is really really frightening, was a study that was done by Jennifer Everhart, who's done remarkable work on the field of bias in the criminal justice system. As a matter of fact, she won a MacArthur Fellowship for the work she's done. What they did is they showed pictures like this of African Americans who had been convicted of committing crimes, capital crimes against other African Americans. Now, the reason they did black-on-black crime is because we've known for many, many years that that juries tend to give harsher sentencing to black people when they commit crimes against white people than when they commit crimes against other black people. It's almost as if the jury believes it's worse crime if it's done to a white person. So she wanted to eliminate that as a factor. She showed people pictures and had them separate the pictures in two piles based on Afrocentricity of appearance, mostly darkness of skin, some other features as well, and then looked at sentencing and found that people were 2.5 times more likely to get the death sentence if their skin was darker. Now, if that doesn't run a chill up your spine, I don't know what your belief about social justice is, but it certainly doesn't meet mine.
And so some of the other ways in which it shows up in the workplace and really in the marketplace, there was a study done with regard to different people going in to buy the same car at the same dealership. And so let's look what happens when people are paying a sticker price for a car. What the finding of this particular study was that a white male paid $725 over the sticker price. A white female paid $935 over the sticker price. A black male paid $1,195 over the sticker price, and a black female, that first one was black woman, and a black male paid $1,697 over the invoice price for a car.
Yeah, to be clear, these were averages. It wasn't just individuals. These are averages of hundreds of people who went through this test.
Right. So what we're seeing, these are, we spent a good bit of time talking about some of these examples because I think it's important for people to get a very good sense of the pervasiveness of what exactly is happening. I'm seeing this note here about, wow, as a white female, I feel this in the workplace surrounding with white male colleagues. So again, another experience of difference and what it feels like to be the one who's different. So the reason it's important to share these studies and to give this much evidence, if you will, Howard, is so that people get a sense that even though you might not have noticed this because it might not be your experience, the level of awareness that this information brings allows you to then increase your ability to be aware of what's going on even when it might not personally impact you. Because what we really need is for more people to be aware to become change agents to ultimately make a difference.
Yeah, and this is really important to recognize that we're certainly not suggesting this only happens around race. In fact, just this morning I was in a conversation with an academic who studies how this shows up relative to optimism versus pessimism and how it shows up relative to extroversion versus introversion. So there are all kinds of dynamics. Obviously, we're focusing on race in our conversation today.
Perfect. This is another one, another study that says students with stereotypically black-sounding names are more likely to get labeled as troublemakers and less likely to get called back for interviews. So certainly in academic and school environments, the added degree of scrutiny around students of color, be it black, brown, or other shades, if you will. And Howard, this is an important point. So let's talk a little bit about what are some of the solutions and paths forward with respect to how we come out from under this.
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I know that there's been a lot of people who've been noticing that there's been some research lately about diversity training and specifically unconscious bias training, which has, I think, justifiably asked the question, is this training effective? And in fact, even though many people in the diversity field have been very defensive about some of this research, the reality is there's reason to believe that some of the ways we've done diversity training in the past have not worked very effectively, and particularly the kinds of diversity training that pit people against each other or emphasize the differences. The research shows that that actually can deepen the divide and often make it harder for people to talk about issues moving forward. On the other hand, there's some very foundational research, and this particular study comes from Lehigh University Medical School and University of Arizona Medical School, that workshops that help professionals learn to understand their non-conscious processes. In other words, to focus on how do we make our decisions and give us the skills to look at how to reduce the impact of bias in those decisions, actually end up creating more egalitarian behavior. So it's not so much does training work is what's the right kind of training. I like that, one problem with a lot of this research is it throws all diversity training into a box as if it's all the same. It's kind of like saying, do you like restaurants? Some of us would say, which restaurant are you talking about, the McDonald's or the Four Seasons Hotel restaurant? This is really important. And of course, we know that training is just the beginning of a solution, which also includes structural changes and priming mechanisms to help people remember what they've learned and the right kind of accountability systems, but that's, of course, for another webinar.
Yeah. And I love this question that somebody put up. It is very ingrained, unfortunately. How do we change minds? And so this next part that we're going to talk about is really around the challenges, the fact that race challenges interpersonal relationships between coworkers. And to be honest, I think this is one of the ways that we begin to change people's mind, is to increase people's comfort level with how we talk about race, because we can't solve for anything that we can't talk about. So let's just do another poll. Let's bring up the poll and ask, how comfortable are you discussing race at work? A, very comfortable, B, moderately comfortable, C, depends on the individual, D, moderately uncomfortable, and then E, very uncomfortable. So if you would, please go ahead and put your polling response in.
Oh, wait. Let's do it for
All right, looks like most people are responding here. The poll is open on the right-hand side. Select your response, click on Submit, and let's go ahead and wrap this up, about 20 seconds. And while we're waiting for the official results, just sharing with you that the majority, the largest response is depends on the individual, followed by moderately comfortable.
Interesting. Interesting. So, you know, it's an interesting answer in terms of depends on the individual, because sometimes I think that's code word for maybe not you. So it depends on who it is. So interesting that the majority of us say that there are some cadre of people that they could be comfortable talking with, and then there's another cadre of people that they're absolutely not comfortable talking with. And as for that to be the majority, I think that's very telling. The next response would be moderately comfortable, meaning, you know, kind of sort of on the fence, maybe under the right conditions, on the right topic, kind of in that depend zone. And then we've got 17% of people who are very comfortable. And I really, that number is higher than I might have predicted, and I think that that's great to see.
Yeah, and I think it probably also reflects the group who's turned in to listen to this webinar. Yes. So, you know, obviously people who are interested in the topic, but we do know that this is a real challenge for some people is that they're afraid, even if they're interested, sometimes, and we sometimes reflect on or evaluate people's lack of willingness to converse because we think that they don't always want to talk about it, but in actuality, sometimes it's simply fear that they don't know how to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is I'm not sure that we're all on the same page with regard to if we should and then why should we talk about race in the workplace. And I get asked this question a lot because I know it's a bit of a provocative statement. People are not even sure we should because we've been indoctrinated with the, you know, Employee 101 school of thought that says you don't talk about race, religion, politics, or anything that could be potentially inflammatory like that in the workplace. And so that was good advice at a certain point in time, but certainly as the diversity of our workplaces increased, the need to be able to talk has also increased. And the example I like to use is when the tsunami happened in the Philippines, we, you know, if anybody, I know I certainly did, worked with someone who was from the Philippines, I had absolutely no problem to go to them and ask, how is your family? Have you heard from everyone? And the acknowledgement that this event happening would impact you in a certain way was important for me, not just as a coworker, but just caring about other people. And I think that that's one of the things that we miss with regard to race in the workplace when we underestimate the impact that it's actually having, and that not talking about it is can, in some cases, not all, can intensify the impact because it creates this degree of I don't know, what's the word? It creates this degree of absence and a void with which we can't discuss something that's so obviously being brought to the workplace.
It's almost like our silence becomes a wall between us.
Yes, that's a great way to say it. And so in addition to the impact on talent management that I outlined before, ignoring race and this silent wall can actually exacerbate issues way more than we think. And I love this next quote by Michael Norton that talks about, you know, it's appealing on the surface to think that the best way to approach race is to pretend that it doesn't exist. We often hear, you know, I'm colorblind, I treat everyone the same, I don't see color. But what he's suggesting is that research shows it simply doesn't work. We do notice race, and there's no way of getting around this. We're not colorblind, and quite frankly, people don't want you to be colorblind. People want to be noticed and acknowledged and appreciated for who they are. And the end result of this is that the ultimate dialogue that comes from an increased comfort level increases the degree of trust that happens between coworkers, between teammates, and we already know that engagement, collaboration, and creativity ultimately breeds innovation. And I don't know that I've ever worked with an organization for which innovation was not a primary target and business driver. So if we know that this is one element, one lever that we could potentially move in order to get us to that bottom line impact, I think it's worth the investment of the initial awkwardness. So this is an interesting example because this is the dynamic of what's actually happening when two people meet each other. So Howard, you used the example before of you and I meeting, or any random white male and let's just say a brown woman who meet each other, and then, you know, you might be thinking on your end, okay, great, I'm an African-American female on my team, right?
Yeah, what do I call her? What word do I use? African American, black, person of color. If I give her feedback, will she think I'm racist? I wonder how long it took her to do those braids. You know, all of these things are in my background. The more we know each other for who we are, the less we treat each other like what we are. But when we first meet each other, we have nothing to rely on other than our past filters. I might question myself too. I might say, am I strong enough? Am I in control enough? Am I likable enough? Am I managing racism on my part? I may be worried about how anything I say might be interpreted by her.
And on my end, I might be thinking, okay, great, another male boss. I wonder what his experience tells him about me. Is he wondering about my braids? Is that going to be considered sophisticated? Will he give me honest, objective feedback? And I could be wondering if you're making a judgment about me. And so it could lead to questions where, you know, I start questioning, am I smart enough? Am I coming across as strong enough with enough executive presence? Am I too strong? Am I being perceived as the angry black woman? And let's just say that the brain space where all these questions are happening is simply brain space where new ideas are not happening. And it's this trigger language, these little triggers that one person might say that then takes the whole rest of the conversation off in a different departure, as opposed to a place where, imagine if we could approach each other and just have a way to talk about race that was empowering. And so one of the things that I'm really proud to have done is to have had a chance to think about this, not just when I was writing my book, Listen In, but in working with different organizations, and that is, what are some guiding strategies that we could use to offer as this path forward and how we interact with each other with regard to race. And the first one comes from, Howard, what you were talking about earlier, recognizing our own biases, where they come from, the part of it that's sort of unconscious, it's been cultivated by our upbringing, and we become clear where they're perpetuated. We then accept responsibility to be part of the solution. I think that that's so important. I call this the recycling effect. You know, I personally didn't pollute the ocean. I personally am not responsible for damaging the rainforest. But when I drink a bottle of water, I make the extra effort to go to recycle because I'm taking responsibility for being part of the solution. And I think that that's a notion that we need to get rid of some of the blame and be able to just say, personally, I didn't create this. Personally, I might have some baggage, but I'm going to step forward and be a part of the solution. And in that stepping forward, we seek to understand other points of view, seeking to understand that there are places and there are ways that other people will see the world that will be different from us. There are perspectives they will have, experiences that they've gained that will cause two people to see the same event and to see two totally different things. And neither one is right or wrong. They're just seeing the world from their perspective. And this movement towards more conversation gets us to a shared understanding of, what did you mean? Oh, that's interesting. I meant this. And we can see what those differences are. The challenging part is we can't get to understanding other points of view unless and until, really, we become willing to engage and be vulnerable in those conversations. Totally recognizing that this is hard. It's hard to put yourself out there. It's hard to be the first one to take a step or take a stand or to even ask a coworker a question that you're not sure what they're going to say. I often say, if you're not sure what they're going to say, then start your question with, you know, I'm not sure what you're going to say, but I really just feel feel the need to ask you blank, you know, and just being vulnerable enough to say, I don't have all of the answers. I acknowledge, you know, kind of name and notice that this is awkward, but I value the relationship such that I really just want to know.
And even saying, I notice I'm a little nervous about talking to you about this, actually is a statement of intimacy. I'm letting you into my world a little bit. It's likely to build trust when I say that because you now know that I'm being vulnerable with you.
Absolutely, and that degree of vulnerability will be so appreciated. I think what happens is that's where the fear kicks in. There's a fear that if I'm vulnerable, there'll be some response that's negative, and really what we found is that people appreciate the degree of vulnerability, that it diffuses the fear. It might even, you know, diffuse what may otherwise have been a negative response, but the sheer sincerity of the approach is so valuable. So the other strategy is to increase your skills and your comfort level with people you consider others, and that is to practice. You know, if you're not comfortable starting off with your coworkers at work, start off with people who might be in your church or community group or in the same organization as you. And above all, resist the temptation for perfection and promote the benefits of progress. The fact that this is a journey. We're not saying that this is anywhere that people are going to just arrive, but promote the benefits of the actual progress. And so, Howard, you reminded me of this quote from the movie.
It's from the movie I Bought a Zoo, and there's this great line when Matt Damon is like, he's talking to somebody. He says, you know, there's certain things in life that only need 20 seconds of courage, and this is one of those examples. You know, starting that conversation is always the hardest thing. Once we get into the conversation, usually, you know, we can find our way, especially if we're doing it in a constructive way. But sometimes it's those first words that are the hardest, and it really does take that 20 seconds of courage. So we want to talk about what are some things to think about as we have these conversations.
Yeah, so we've come up, so I have a couple of tips here, and you'll notice that I have working while black in quotes, which is especially for that reason that someone mentioned very early on. We use this term, this phrase colloquially. I've also heard breathing while brown. And just as a way that if you are a person of color in the workplace, what are a couple tips that could serve us? And that first one is seek first to understand. Keep in mind that you might be perceiving what someone says as something that had malintent, but maybe assume positive intent first and then add a few probing questions to make sure that if you are interpreting something as offensive, that that was actually the intention, and if it was not the intention, give the other person an opportunity to clarify what they may have meant. Also, this need to be self-reflective. I often have coached people to say, you know, sometimes you are the problem. Sometimes your hypersensitivity might in fact be what's causing you to misinterpret what was something that was just nothing and misinterpret it as something. And so have the degree of discernment that says, okay, not everything is worth a battle over. There are some things that are worth just letting them be a teachable moment or letting them not be heard at all. And by all means, if there is a teachable moment, to engage in that teachable moment in an appropriate, respectful way.
And it's important to realize that stereotypes go both ways. There may be somebody who genuinely is reaching out for connection, but because you've had experience with people like that not being trustworthy or being racist or something in the past, that you may deflect or even protect when somebody could actually be there in a way that they'd like to build a relationship.
This notion of being mindful of other groups, I totally recognize that because of the degree of polarity and the focus on the African American community, that sometimes the challenges in other communities, for example, the Native American community, the Hispanic community, and other groups of color gets minimalized and marginalized because of the pervasiveness of, say, police brutality. And I just really think it's important to be mindful of the challenges that other groups have and a degree of compassion for their voice as well. And then the other ultimate piece is to trust that conversations do matter and that dialogue does move the needle. And if we approach these conversations conversations from a place of trust, I think we can make a huge difference.
You know, there are a couple of, before we switch to the next slide, there are a couple of quick responses that I think are worth noting. One person said, I think it's more about relationship and vulnerability. I'm more likely to be open if I have trust with someone. That's so true, along the lines of what Allison was just saying. As I said before, the more we know people for who they are, the less we treat them like what they are. If you've established a personal relationship with somebody, it's a lot easier to talk about race with them than when they're a stranger, in which case you're likely to put more stereotypes. Also, somebody said sometimes people's response is not authentic, and you can tell by their physical reactions, and that, of course, is also going to be something that we'll see very frequently in dealing with issues of race, because people are protected and are looking for the right thing to say rather than their honest thing to say. Now, on the other hand, of course, if we're in the dominant group, in this case white, given race, some similarities, seeking first to understand rather than to make assumptions, and there's not much I can add to what Allison said, and assuming that you're not being held personally responsible. This is so important because often we can be personally affected by something even if we're not personally responsible for it. For example, you know, as a white Jewish man whose family didn't come to this country until the 20th century, I'm obviously not personally responsible for slavery in this country, but the fact of the impact that slavery had on the relationship between whites and African Americans still affects me in my relationships with blacks who I interact with. So it's important. That doesn't mean I need to beat myself up or feel guilty about it, but it does mean I need to be responsible for how that shows up. And one way I can deal with that is by demonstrating open compassion, for really trying to put myself into the world of somebody else, to understand, to develop empathy for what that world might be like. And the more we know people who are different from us, the more we're likely to get that point of view and understand that point of view. As Allison said earlier, we live in an we're fortunate to work in an incredibly diverse environment where we have, you know, a very robust mix of different kinds of people, and we have, therefore, the opportunity to get a sense of what people are feeling in ways that we might not if we were working in homogeneous, either one of us were working in homogeneous environments. The fourth one here is so important for us, and that is to recognize how white privilege binds our interpretation. And the thing that's really important is sometimes white privilege is used as a weapon, almost like you have white privilege, like an attack line, as opposed to an actual concept. And that is that white privilege, whether we like it or not, if we're in the majority, if we're in the dominant group, we benefit from that in subtle and not so subtle ways. Accepting that that's the case and watching out for it, looking at how it affects our interpretation, doesn't mean there's something wrong with us, or it just we happen to grow up into a culture in which that's true. And finally, to trust that conversation matters. Oops. There we go. So, you know, to bring this together, we have to understand each other, of course. We have to understand the impact we have on each other. We have to engage in new behaviors. But the key in all of this starts with understanding ourselves. And if we create a mindset around this that has us attacking each other or blaming each other, we're far more likely to be defensive with each other than we are to really listen with each other. So in that regard, just want to share with you a couple of, before we complete, a couple of things that we want to know are available from Cook-Ross View. One is we've developed free resource guides to know how to facilitate these discussions. Those resource guides are available on our website, www.cookross.com. You can download them with instructions how to use them, and we absolutely encourage you to do that. We also have public courses. For example, on May 2nd, we have a one-day course on everyday bias that's available. There's locations. I'm afraid I don't have a location of that, but if you come to our website, you can see that. We do a Train the Trainer program on unconscious bias, a public Train the Trainer. That's going to be May 9th through 12th here in Silver Spring in our offices. And we did one of those just a couple months ago, and I'm getting constant notes back from people who are telling how well the trainings are going. We've actually had tremendous success with that. We also have a 3-day unconscious bias learning lab, June 7th through 9th, and in that program what we do is we go through the science and application of all of the kinds of things that we're talking about so that people really can go back with a depth of understanding about how that plays out. Let's jump ahead here. Good. And then a few books, two that I wrote, Reinventing Diversity and Everyday Bias. Everyday Bias obviously focuses on unconscious bias, and Allison's book, Listen In, which is a wonderful tool for understanding how these conversations occur in the workplace and what are some things that you can do about them. We also do individualized or more focused work with our organizational clients where we help facilitate conversations. We're hoping, by the way, that some of you who are gathered together to watch this will stick around afterwards and use this as a springboard for possibly generating conversations in your own organization. Good. So we're going to, oh, by the way, if there's any contacts, we'll give you that in just a moment, but we've got a few minutes left, and so we want to open it up for some questions.
Oh, that's nice. It's really wonderful to share some of the resources for free. Someone is mentioning that they're using Cook Ross for their UB classes, and I'll be leveraging those resource guides to start these conversations. That's wonderful to hear.
Yeah, that's great. So if anybody has any questions, please filter them. We've got a few minutes where we could respond to a few questions. Or if there's something we said that you want to offer a different perspective on, we'll certainly be willing to share that as well. And while we're waiting for that, I think, at the core, like anything else in life that we're afraid of, what we need to deal with this is courage. We need to look at ourselves and stop and say, what's stopping me from having a conversation that I need to have? That's true whether I'm, holding back on a conversation with my wife or a friend of mine or a conversation like this. And the irony is that when we don't have these conversations, we invariably make this worse.
So someone was asking, do we travel around or do we stay in the D.C. area? As one of the people who travels around, we absolutely do. We have consultants who are in all parts of the world, actually, on any given week. And Howard, I wanted to make a point about what you said about the importance of the personal relationship. I want to get back to this notion of how organizations solve for this issue, because certainly in the D&I space, we've been at this for about 50 years now in terms of trying to move the needle on inclusion in our organizations with varied levels of success at different times in history inside different organizations. And I think the message that I'd like to send more than anything is that for organizations who are serious about this, there is a methodology that works to do this. There really are proven ways that you can move the needle, some of them in the very tactical talent management realms that I mentioned. Some of them have to do with other areas of the business, whether it's customer service or employee or client connection or customer connection. There are some real ways that this work can be done. And so I just want to send the message to people who are decision makers in organizations that, we can't really use the excuse anymore that we're trying, because there are new ways and new approaches that are actually working.
Absolutely, absolutely. We have clients who are producing some pretty extraordinary turnarounds doing this work. Another question, some of our Middle Eastern physicians have indicated that they've been experiencing discrimination outside of the workplace. What advice can you offer for us to provide support to these physicians? This is so important. One of the things we have to recognize is that a lot of what Middle Eastern folks in the United States are dealing with today is obviously deeply fear-based, and it's important to recognize that that's fear that we're dealing with. We tend to see it as hate. Hate is usually a secondary reaction to fear. We hate people we're afraid of. But if we deal with the hate, we're never going to get to the core issue. So we've got to take that conversation down to fear and use fundamental, and this is true for example, transphobia, for Islamophobia, for LGBT-related bias, all of these kinds of things. That is our fear that get there.
And I just want to make a point about this question here. I think that race discussions in the workplace are important, but do we need to pick our battles and assess when and how to engage? I love that point, and it's a point that actually I make in Listen In. I have these disclaimers, of which one of them is, sometimes the right answer is to not engage in a conversation. And I often say, if you find yourself in a situation where the person is very rock solid in their thought, they may have limited experience or exposure, they may actually not be the right person to even engage, because they lack all of the other elements that are required. Then my advice is to politely excuse yourself from the conversation and refuse to engage. And so I really love that point, that we're not suggesting that everyone should leave this webinar and go charge into into a conversation. Not at all. You're absolutely right. Assess the circumstances before you go and do this, and make sure that you have some degree of belief that there can be something positive to come out of it.
Yeah, I think that we need to create a conversation for relationship before we get into this conversation. And one of the most important things we could do is to create an agreement with the other people we're talking with, that we're here to understand each other, we're here to get a better sense of where you're coming from. We're not here to convince you, we're not here to debate, and that can open it up. One last series of questions. Somebody said, how do you give an example of how a team leader can start the conversation? And that ties into another question, do you have experience with leading a race dialogue in the workplace? Yes, the answer to the second one is we absolutely do. We've done this many, many times for many different kinds of organizations, not just in the U.S., but outside of the U.S. as well. The best way a team leader can start the conversation is by allowing people to see or setting a container that the conversation can occur in. In other words, what's the purpose of our conversation? What are some guidelines we have and some agreements we have for how we're going to have this conversation so that we can agree to a charter, and that way people will feel safer to engage. And then there actually is one last question, which is...
With the amount of fake news stories that are being circulated and accessed by so many that confirm their bias, that's actually a really good point. It makes it difficult to present the real facts and contradict their ingrained beliefs. What do you suggest? So there's two parts to that. The first part is what I just mentioned, assessing whether or not someone with ingrained beliefs is actually the right person for you to engage in conversation with. And then secondly, to see if there is room for some alternate facts, if you will, if they're open to having a conversation that includes other potential information. So we're at the top
We are
of
at
the
time,
hour.
so we have one quick little video clip to show you. But before that, a couple of people have asked for information, how to reach us. You can see that I can be reached at howard.ross@cookross.com. Allison Manswell can be reached at allison.manswell@cookross.com. So we want to thank you. We're just going to end with this last video, but we want to, before that, thank you. We ended up having over almost 400 people actively participating, and as I said at the beginning, that says something about how important this issue is. Allison, it's been a pleasure doing this with you.
It has been such a pleasure, Howard, to do this with you as well.
So, and Helen, thank you. Could you show the last video, and we wish everybody the best.
Yeah, sounds good. Last video is being loaded as we speak right now, and again, reminder that the video is going to be playing. Sound is going to be heard from your computer speakers. So this is loading up as we speak.
And we just wanted to leave on a positive note, because there are always encouraging things happening about race as well, and it's easy to see only the negative, and that can sap us of our energy to do this work. So we want to highlight this quick little video, which is entitled "The Message of Love."
And it's coming.
So we'll leave that with you. Please be well, and let us know if we can support you in any way. Have a great day.
All right, thank you everyone for joining today's session. To leave today's session, just go ahead and click the X in the top right corner of the screen. We've had many questions about the recording. It will be posted in 10 to 14 days on the Cook Ross website. Thanks everyone for joining today's session. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.